Hello, everyone. My name is Giuseppe Martinico, and this is the second seminar of our series devoted to crowdsourced and deliberative constitution making processes. Today we have the pleasure, the immense pleasure to have Professor Verdugo with us. Sergio Verdugo is professor of law at the Instituto de Empresa Law School in Madrid, where he teaches constitutional law and human rights law. He's also one of the editors of the International Journal of Constitutional Law and the Secretary General of the International Society of Public Law. Before joining the Instituto de Empresa, he was director of the Center for Constitutional Justice of the Universidad de Desarrollo School of Law in Chile. He holds a doctorate in law from the NYU, a master's degree law from the University of California, Berkeley. His research interests include comparative constitutional law, political rights, constitutional theory, and many other things. His work has been published in very important journals. I want to just mention the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law, the International Journal of Constitutional Law, the Hague Journal on the Rule of Law, among others. And today is the perfect speaker to discuss the latest developments, and not only the latest developments actually of the constituent process in Chile. So I'm very happy and I'm also happy to say that also on behalf of Matteo Monti, who is the other co-director of this course, we are very happy that Sergio has accepted our invitation. It means a lot to us, and I'm sure it will give an added value to this series of webinars. Having said that, without further delay, I would like to give the floor to Sergio. Thanks indeed for joining us. Ready where you are.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you particularly to Giuseppe for the invitation. So I prepare a talk that is aimed at people that is not familiar with the Chilean case. But I'm trying to situate the Chilean case in a broader arguments about what do we know and what are we learning from the constitution making processes that we see these days. Give me a second so I can share my screen. Okay, so you see my screen, right?
Yes.
And when I pass it?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so the question that interests me is how constitution making processes fail, right?
Perhaps, if I may, Sergio, you should trigger the slideshow, perhaps. Yes.
Okay.
Now it's perfect. Thank you. Sorry.
Excellent. So the question that interests me is how constitution making processes fail, which is, I think, a question that there's just not enough literature on it. So, for example, if you take into, I was rereading the other day this landmark book on the endurance of national constitutions, which is crucial for constitution making. And when they address the example of the constitution making processes in France, for example, they omit the May 1946 referendum, which it was the first attempt to build the Fourth Republic, that failed, right? It's just not mentioned. There's a lot of missed opportunities of examining failures of constitution making processes. Normally, the literature likes to focus more on the success stories rather than on the failures. Of course, there are some countries that are an exception, and I think Chile is one of those. Another one is Iceland, when we see another failure. But we need to theorize more. So understanding these cases more will shed light on how these processes fail. So the idea is not to only focus on the typical stories that scholars tend to cite, like Colombia 1991, South Africa, India, the typical processes that are deemed to be successful in adverse conditions, but also to understand how processes fail. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to set the problem, then what the contribution of my argument is to the problem. Then I'm going to address the CHILEAN process, and then I'm going to set some questions and conclusions for the end. So really, the literature has focused. Are the slides passing, by the way? No. I don't think they are. No.
No. Now, yes.
Okay. So we really know a lot about success stories of constitution making experiments. We know that success is tied to consensual and post-sovereign approaches. Places where rival factions tend to achieve an agreement. There's also some evidence showing that the level of inclusiveness made during the constitution making processes matters for the endurance of the constitutions and also for the output of the constitution. There's recent evidence put by Zach Elkins and Alexander Hudson on referendums that is particularly illuminative on the issue of referendums, which is not the only way in which constitution making processes are approved or can fail, but it's relevant evidence that we have now. The first thing that I need to do is to tell you what do I mean when I mean failed constitution making processes. And here I think there are two types of failures. So one failure is the authoritarian failure. So it's a constitution making process that is either pushed by politicians that have an authoritarian agenda, or that is captured later by an incumbent dominant coalition that use the process for a democratic deterioration. This is the first type of failure. On this question, there's a lot of research. You can see the research on Hungary, on Venezuela, and so on. But the second type of failure, which is the one that interests me more, is the one that has less research, I think, which is the activation failure. When a constitution cannot pass, the constitution can be very popular. It can start with a lot of political capital, but then is not passed. So my argument here is situated within a democratic assumption. So I'm not making an argument based on countries that are establishing a new state, but rather I am focusing on countries that have already representative institutions in place. And therefore, we expect them to have a lot of actors with invested interests in the process. So the question is how to deal with those interests. I assume that the constituent power theory is less appealing in this process. This is a normative assumption. I have written elsewhere about this issue. I think that the more representative institutions exist, the less appealing the constituent power narrative becomes, and because then we need to find the right balance between continuity and change, and emphasize less the radical nature of the dismantling of the previous political institutions. But representative institutions have incumbent actors that compete for power, and some of them may have incentives to protect and preserve the current institutional arrangements. People like John Esther and others have proposed that to deal with this problem, we should have a separate extraordinary organ like a constituent assembly that can look long-term. That is not backed up by evidence, I think. It's just a theoretical assumption. And there are different ways to deal with this. So normally, the failure is produced when agreements among those who compete for power is not achieved. So we're speaking about repeat players that expect to remain in powers, that have quotas of power during the process, can become veto players, can push for institutional resistance during the process. And the question is whether we need to ignore them and leave them down, and if we include them. And if we include them, how do we include them so that they don't veto completely the process, or they don't boycott the necessary changes that we need to achieve? This is not a good, an easy balance to find. The political party system also may have problems of their own, problems that are not common to, that are very common today in modern democracies, where party systems are generally losing a lot of credibility between public opinion. My claim is that political parties should be a relevant component of constitution making process, whatever the design is. Second, the design of a post-sovereign procedure is not sufficient if we don't secure the first one. We have assumed If you take a look at the older work of Arato, for example, that it is that having a post-sovereign procedure may be sufficient to guarantee the types of consensual agreements that are necessary to push for a constitution. This could be a relevant condition, but it's not a necessary condition for that, and I think the Chilean case is a good example of that. And third, political parties may still be biased in favor of the status quo. So this is a double-edged sword. So first, why political parties? Well, political parties help to lower the transaction costs that political elites have. Generally, a strong, well-organized political party system will be more inclined to achieve multi-party agreements compared to single-issue, multiple movements that are not expecting to be repeat players. They also improve substantive representation in the sense that they reduce the information costs of the voters. So if you're going to have electoral mechanisms, you need to have a party system. And I mean, I'm working in the scenario in which a party system already exists, but you need to use it. The problem is that it's an insufficient and probably a very flawed party system. So you need to take care of those flaws. Include a sense of institutional continuity to the process then is important. For example, having default rules in case of agreements that fail could be a useful thing. You also need to control outsiders that may boycott the process. This argument also allows us to connect content and substance. So there's this big agreement on whether the process of constitution making processes are connected to the substantive outcome in the end. We know a little bit about this, but we know that is at least partly relevant. The level of inclusivity, we know that is at least partly relevant. We also may assume that the more current repeat players participate in the process, the more they will design rules that will advance their own interests. So if you have a president seeking for re-election, you may assume that that president will have an interest in the rules about re-election, just to give a very simple example. But if we look broader to the literature on, for example, on judicial independence, on the creation of constitutional courts, on independent public prosecutors, and on other specific institutional arrangements, you will see a strong correlation between the idea of having multi-parties and agreements or processes that are driven not in a unilateral way, but in a consensual way, and the development of institutions that, if you believe in political liberalism and restraints to political power and a more classical version of a constitution, you will be likely to endorse. Of course, if you don't like independent constitutional courts that will have a strong power of judicial review, then then this argument will be less persuasive with you. But we know at least that there will be, and it has many names. Some people call it insurances, or people refer to the connection between constitutional origins and liberal democracy and so on. But we know that there is a dynamic in which counter-majoritarian arrangements aimed at protecting minorities, including different types of minorities, is largely connected to the presence of those minorities and to the power that those minorities may have in the constitution-making process. And this can work to benefit an elite that wants to entrench in power. Think, for example, of the white minority in the South African case with property rights, but it can also work to benefit those of a weaker political minority. And I think that when you so political parties can help, right, to have those dynamics exist in the process. When you deal with single issue groups, many advantages of having the party system disappear. Right, so the single issue groups are not expected to be repeat players necessarily. They are full of social and political leaders, which we know a little bit of information, but not too much. They will typically push for a very specific agenda, but we won't know many things that they will advance. So, for example, if you have a feminist leader running for election, she will advocate on a campaign in favor of the rights of women, but we will know little about her view on how the political system should be designed. We will know little about her views on issues like healthcare or other issues that could become politically relevant. So the information costs for the voters tend to elevate when you have these groups dominating the political campaigns. And that can create a distance between public opinion and the content that these groups will advance later. When you have these single issue candidates running, then you will expect them to just aggregate preferences, right? But the way they will aggregate preferences doesn't necessarily mean that those preferences will align well with the median voter, and that could be a problem. So those movements have an advantage. The advantage that is a very attractive advantage. The advantage that they have is that they can provide for more descriptive or symbolic ways of representation. I'm using Pitkin's, but they are usually very bad in providing substantial and ideological representation. So if you see the Chilean Constitutional Convention, you will see that the Chilean Constitutional Convention represented the society, the Chilean society, descriptively, very fairly, right? All the social classes were well represented. You have a lot of indigenous peoples there. You have people that didn't come from the wealthiest high schools of the country and so on. But you will have a politically unbalanced convention anyway, because those groups are not elected on real, complete ideological platforms where where voters had complete information, right? So that can create a problem and an important tension that needs to be taken into account. And the whole thing happens into the famous John Elster paradox that Elster theorized in 1995. So he claimed, that we should have, so constitution making processes are supposed to fix a very deep crisis. The crisis is the cause of why we have a constitution making process, but the crisis is also the reason why the constitution making processes may fail in the first place. So the adverse conditions that work against the success of the constitution making process are the same conditions that justify the existence of the constitution making process in the first place. So we should not expect then democratic and electoral mechanisms to work perfectly. Right. So in the situation and the context that interests me, like you have representative institutions in place, you won't expect those representative institutions to work very well, and you will expect to have them very detached from public opinion in the first place. So then the big issue is, what do we do when the party system is in trouble? And the temptation to bring independence and leaders from social movements is very strong, right? It happened in Iceland, it happened in Chile also. And the reason why it is strong is because we are trying to use the system to basically replace the political elite for a new political elite. It doesn't mean that these people are not political. It doesn't mean also, as Elster wrongly assumed, that they will have long-term interests that will drive the process. That's wrong. What is true is that those interests will be more independent than those of members of political parties that are trying to entrench the parties more. But what those interests are is more obscure, right? We need more evidence about that. And I think the Chilean case is interesting for it. So let me give you some background on the Chile's case. Now, so the story is very long, but I don't want to start from Adam and Eve. As most of you may know, the Chilean constitution was drafted by an authoritarian regime. There was a plebiscite in 1980 that approved the constitution by a large majority, but of course the democratic conditions of that plebiscite were completely inexistent. So it's a constitution that never really got legitimized. When Chile transitioned to democracy, Chile decided not to replace the constitution entirely, because the defenders and the supporters of the authoritarian regime were actually part of the transition. So Chile instead decided to continue with the same constitution that guaranteed certain advantages to those that were leaving power at that time, but that also set up a transition that was supposed to be driven by a more consensual type of politics. And that consensual type of politics meant that the constitution was going to be amended gradually, incrementally, as years passed in a very slow way, but not, and the less the Pinochet factor influenced, the more the amendments could become a reality, right? But a total replacement was out of the table at that time. So what happened later is that we had many amendments to the Pinochet constitution. We have informal changes that are very important. So for example, today, social rights are more important than before, right? The original nature of the constitution was to have a more market-based approach to the protection of rights, with strong property rights, with the unenforceability of social rights and so on. But the jurisprudence has gradually changed that. And we also have very important formal amendments that have at the constitutional and also at the sub-constitutional level that had shaped the political process in ways that were not predicted originally by the Pinochet regime, right? So the Pinochet constitution was consistent in creating a strong presidential system with two coalitions, with relevant constitutional review, with a politically consequential military that was supposed to protect the democratic regime under the ideology of the national security doctrine, with economic subsidiarity and non-justiciable social rights. It was a very consistent political, kind of neoliberal, conservative, and natural law-inspired agenda. But all the, and this is, of course, a very huge simplification. All the amendments that came and the informal changes that came during these years changed radically this agenda. Perhaps not in a very conscious way, because the changes came incrementally. So what the amenders of 1989 and 2005 did, perhaps they didn't predict how the system will become as we see it today. So what we see today is a multi-party system that is very fragmented, with 18 political parties, so very far away, and with coalitions having trouble to build majorities in Congress. We still have a presidential system, but we have minority presidents that are very unlikely to pass relevant reforms. And we see this. We have seen this in the past governments. We have a very relevant constitutional court now, partly because of the amendment of 2005, but also partly because the tool of the ex-ante review process became politically consequential, and political actors have used it, partly because of a collective action problem that exists. And an accountability problem, who takes the responsibility for this. The military became politically independent. We have a weak presidentialism. We have subsidiarity still, but also the principle of solidarity has become very important in the previous years. And we have a flawed but existed justiciable social rights. The most important thing is that we have strong gridlock. So relevant things do not happen. So if Chileans care about making a huge amendment to the social security system, that won't happen, right? Because the majorities to do that amendment are very unlikely to be passed. Presidents last only for 4 years without the possibility of re-election, and because the presidents are elected in a second round usually, but the Congress is elected in the first round, the presidents have an electoral incentive to actually win the strongest minority in Congress and not the strongest majority. There's no such thing as pacts to build coalitions in Chile, ruling coalitions. The amendments were not enough, of course. They changed the constitution drastically, and we have a very dysfunctional system in Chile. But there was a very important symbolic problem. The Pinochet legacy was never really removed. The idea of having a constitution that was cheating, because all these dynamic, all these institutional arrangements were preventing also progressive changes from happening, made some public intellectuals build this idea that the constitution was cheating and was subsidizing the votes of the right-wing coalition. I think that the problem can work both ways, right? So it's not a problem only of the right, but it was more visible during the Bachelet administration, so it was more harmful for the socialist agenda. Also, the problem of legislative inertia remained in Chile, and very strongly. Who takes responsibility for it? And politicians blame each other, and also now blame the courts about it. So many attempts came actually to change the constitution. I think an important one came in 2005 when President Lagos presented a very important amendment to the constitution as a new constitution itself. Everybody agreed that the amendment should happen, so they voted it in favor. And the amendment was very important because it removed most of the authoritarian enclaves of the Pinochet constitution. But, and this is a very important but, everyone also denied Pinochet's, Lagos' symbolic gesture of this is the constitution, this is a new constitution. Lagos even changed the signature of Pinochet and replaced it by his own, because he loves himself so much, but also because he wanted to build this symbolic new constitution and move the page on. But political parties from the left and from the right denied that. The Pinochet legacy was still strong at that moment at the political level. Then it came, we have other attempts before that failed that were like small, like President Frey's campaign, for example, but then he lost the election. But we had a very serious attempt in 2017 when in the second administration of President Bachelet, right? She didn't succeed to have an agreement of the political parties and to do it through the Congress. So what she did instead is to appeal directly to the people. And she kind of used a very interesting procedure in which she tried to combine the best things about deep deliberations with small groups and massive participation from a large number of groups. And by achieving this, I mean, these are two things that are in tension, but she tried to do both, right? So she organized top-down council meetings, but she also invited the people to organize bottom-up local town hall meetings that allowed people to present proposals. There was also an indigenous consultation process. There were institutions set up, a committee that was supposed to systematize everything, also a commission composed in a bipartisan way of observers that look at the process and certify the different things. But that process failed and failed drastically. What happened there is that Bachelet never really got the support of the political parties. We don't really know much about how the participatory mechanisms could translate into the draft that she presented in the end of the process. There's no real way to trace back those things, so there's a huge problem of what citizens expect to see. And then we have the problem that there was a corruption scandal at the time related to her stand that also harmed her government a lot. But she never really advanced the process seriously in an institutional way. And she submitted the final proposal when she was a lame duck president. After President Piñera was elected, she was supposed to leave office. And I wrote a paper about this with my friend Jorge Contese, who is also listening, to explain what happened here. But there were some ideas during this process that remain, and I think that became really important even today. One of them is that the process should be institutional. Another one is that the process should be participatory. And another one that the process should be democratic. Also, a lot of demands became very relevant during this process, like women's demands, indigenous demands, and so on. So even though the process failed, some ideas remain. Then we have the 2019-2022 constitution making process that I'm going to explain a little bit, and then the constitution making process that started this year, 2023, and that is currently ongoing. We had elections last Sunday about it. So the process that failed last year started really with the social outbreak of 2019. Right, so there was a rise in the price of the metro ticket of Santiago. It was done in a technocratic way by an institution that was not driven by, that was not really accountable to the public. And President Piñera endorsed it. President Piñera, that was a right-wing president. So the students started to protest, and they called for to basically sabotage the metro and not pay the metro ticket as a sort of response to that. But quickly, many people and movements joined the protests, and other demands became visible during the process. We have the demands for social security, the demands for healthcare, the demand for a dignified housing. Then we have the feminist demands, the environmental demands. We have indigenous demands. We have water-related issues that in Chile are very strong that also joined the protest. So we have a heterogeneous set of demands. Some people have tried to identify common factors. the massive social dissatisfaction with the system is very evident, but the heterogeneous set of demands kind of also make things a little bit difficult to perceive. So political parties offered a constitution-making process to deal with it. How do we deal with this problem? The president needs to resign, and we need to reboot the state. How do we deal with it? And in the middle of all the chaos that existed, human rights violations by the police, emergency regime declared, a very chaotic situation in which protesters threatened to enter the private residence of the president and so on. In that chaotic, anarchic scenario, a constitution-making process was offered to the people. And if you look at the polls at that time, they will, this is only an example, they will usually tell you that the main driver of the demand for a new constitution was attached to issues related to social rights in a general broad way. And many people have interpreted this in a different way. I interpret it in a way in which the people is tired about politicians not delivering social legislation. So that is the problem of legislative inertia, right? But then we have this paradox that people attack the Constitution and the Bill of Rights part of the Constitution for that, when we should be targeting not the Bills of Rights part, in my opinion at least, but the way the structure of the political process is. So then we have all this problem that many people like Adam and Mila are writing now about Chile, about this, how the issue of having social rights in the Constitution can really help politicians to gain some time with it, but not really respond to the real issue, right? So a constitution can facilitate the process for the long-term public policies to be passed, but we really need those public policies to be passed for the issues to be solved. For that, we need political agreements that are unlikely to happen in the current political Chilean structure. And that's the main issue, and that's why we need to revise the issues of the organic part of the Constitution more than the Bill of Rights. So a lot of attention has been put into the way the Bill of Rights is organized, and I think that's wrong. But that's my own view about that. So we have the November agreement, the 2019 November agreement. The parties offered this constitution-making process to the system. It was based on it was a political agreement that then it was detailed by a technical committee composed of lawyers appointed by the political parties. But it was really driven by the parties with representation in Congress and not by the president, who removed himself from the constitutional debate and basically invited the parties to solve the issue, and he endorsed them later. And this is really relevant because normally constitution-making processes have a strong president behind them, right? It was not the case in Chile at that time, and it is not the case in Chile with the new process that started in 2023, which President Boric is not going to, and this is a prediction, is not going to be able to endorse by his own political, with his own political capital. So the design was post-sovereign, so the interests of the parties were present here. We were supposed to, the idea was to resemble more or less what existed at that time in the Chamber of Deputies, which is a very fragmented chamber that has representation for all relevant political forces, but political elites from the right to the left, but where there is no clear majority. So it was a process that was designed for to be driven by consensual agreements. And they also approved a two-thirds rule that was going to put to increase the costs of the agreement, so that only things that were really, really consensual among those that differ could be passed. This is not what happened, right, in the end, but this was the design, this was the idea in the beginning. They were trying to avoid this, right, which is the picture of the Venezuelan, the Chavez Constitutional Assembly. They were trying to avoid that. They didn't want a dominant party system to exist. They wanted a fragmented constituent assembly. Most political parties signed the deal, except the Republicanos, which is the far-right party that today is dominating the Constitutional Council. And also the far left. The far left was divided on whether to support the November agreement. The majority of the far left didn't approve it, but you could see that President Boric, which at that time had a longer beard, did endorse the agreement at that time, which was very important because he was going to become president. After certain rules were approved to change the original agreement, so gender parity, for example, was approved, special rules for independence, and reserved seats for indigenous peoples. I think that the parties lost control of the process because of rules 2 and 3. The rules that gave particular privileges for independence or for indigenous people made the parties lose control of the process. Okay? We have the entry plebiscite. The constitution making process was supposed to be endorsed by the people for it to be authorized. 77.85% approved the new constitution making process. And on the second question of the plebiscite, which the people was called to decide on whether the constitution was going to be written by a elected assembly or by a mixed convention composed by sitting legislators and elected citizens. The people largely decided on the elected assembly with a 78.97%. This number is stronger than the 77.85 of the approval vote for the new constitution making process, and this is no minor detail. I read this result, this second result, as the people rejecting the party system. The party system is embedded in the Congress, right? Only parties that stay in Congress can survive. So generally, the people said, we don't want sitting legislators sitting in the new assembly. We want new people. And the option was then a constituent assembly elected with the rules of the Chamber of Deputies, but with the modifications of gender parity, the privileges for independent candidates, and the reserved seats for indigenous peoples. The main reasons for voting approval, the polls of at that time in Chile will tell you, are also necessary, are also connected to the issue of social rights. And the expectation was to have a Chamber of Deputies, that an assembly that will more or less resemble the political balance of the Chamber of Deputies at that time, but that didn't happen. What we had instead was a socially inclusive convention. Lots of women, lots of indigenous, lots of lower class people entering into the convention, but a very politically unbalanced convention where the ideological representation of the society was poorly organized. This was the result. As you could see, no one had any clear majority. The blue ones on the left represent the right-wing coalition, which only got 37 out of 155. The traditional left only got 25. This is the Bachelet coalition. And then we had the far left, which got 28, and all the other groups were different. I think a relevant one was the Lista del Pueblo, which later fragmented, which got 27 votes, but it was relevant because they really campaigned on the literal death of President Piñera. So they had like a literal platform that was attacking the existing institutions at that time. So this was an anti-party platform, and people elected these people not because they believed in their overall platforms, because we knew very little about those platforms. They voted because the political campaigns were rejecting the political elites at that time. Only 5 out of 79 electoral pacts corresponding to pacts organized by political parties. 103 independents were elected out of 155. 55 of those is not packed with any party, right? So these numbers are very, very relevant. And with the indigenous people, we also see that the indigenous people came with platforms from the left that many people claim today that were not representative of the median indigenous voter. And a big question that scholars are still debating is why the turnout for the indigenous ballot was so low compared to the other one. But it's a problem that existed in this process. And actually, the president of the convention the first president of the convention became Elisa Loncon, who is a Mapuche woman and a scholar also. So the convention's functioning started in a very messy way. Many constitution makers invoked the constituent power theory to put pressure on the rules that were pacted before. They challenged the supermajority rules to approve the new norms. They proposed norms and procedures that were against the multi-party agreement. Most, if not all, of these proposals did not pass and were not approved, but they were very important nonetheless because they put a lot of pressure in the process. they polarize the convention even more, and they set an image that the press used then to criticize the convention strongly, as also reproducing all the conflicts that people is tired of seeing from politicians. We were also seeing it from the convention, but in the hands of political newbies that didn't know how to manage their new political agendas. So scandals also happened related to this. The right wing was completely excluded. Also, the center left was partly completely excluded from this. We have some scandals, people voting from the shower, playing the guitar, doing the people dressing like dinosaurs and so on. A lot of performative acts that were not considered to be serious from an institutional perspective, and also perhaps a very important scandal connected to a member, to an independent member that was elected on the basis that he had cancer, and therefore he really believed in changing the healthcare system. But in the end, it was proved that it was a lie. So he was elected on the basis of a lie. He didn't have cancer at all. And all of these things happened because we really didn't know much about these new people. They were all independents that were campaigning on a single issue platform. So there were no political parties that could simplify the information to the voters. So voters were surprised by these things. They were not expecting this. And I read this as, the votings were part of a vote to reject the establishment more than to endorse a long-term vision of how society should be organized. So we saw a lot of unreasonable proposals that are ridiculous, proposals that try to end with the three branches, for example, and stuff like that. None of them passed. None of them were really included in the final proposal. But again, they made a lot of noise and a lot of controversy. And it created a lot of debates that harmed the prestigious of the convention. So we see that the trust in the convention started very high, but started to decline very quickly. But in the end, it was too late. The procedural rules prevented the convention from revising the rules that they had approved before. So when they were overconfident with all the political support, they approved many things that then they couldn't revise later. When it was clear that they needed to moderate themselves to appeal to the median voter. It was just too late. And in many issues, the polls started to show that the proposals made by the convention, serious or not, justified or not, were not very connected to what the median voter believed in. And it was just too late to make the change. So what happened is that President Boric and part of his coalition proposed to, let's approve this and let's change this thing later. And of course, that helped to build this trust in the process. Also, Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia, who is not a guy that many Chileans like, endorsed the constitution arguably. We don't really know, but that could also happen. Also, the Amarillos, a new movement formed with members from the center left, also opposed the new constitution. We also see that the approval ratings started to. Boric was elected, right? We saw the far right also that became more powerful, even though they lost the second round of elections against President Boric, who came from the far left, and started to build a social democrat coalition, even though his origins are from the far left. He tried to build a coalition that could actually replace the center left. But anyway, the distrust of his government started to grow very, very, very high. And in the exit plebiscite, which was made with mandatory vote, with a way higher turnout than the first opening plebiscite, had a 61.87% of rejection, which is very, very strong. And we could see that that these figures of when the reject vote started to become more predominant came later. So by March, so the plebiscite was in September, the convention was supposed to be done by the proposal a few months earlier. By May, it was too late to make real changes to the proposal. But we see that until March, at least, the convention still high support from public opinion. So I think we can learn that the convention was not approached as an opportunity to fix the party system. Actually, the weakest part of the proposal they made was the design of the political system. There was nothing about the political party system. Even more, there are interpretations of the draft proposal that claimed that they were trying to make social movements and political parties equivalent for the elections in the future, even though these rules were not detailed but merely announced. Political parties lost control of the process, so the interest of building a strong party system just didn't exist. The interest was more based on the fact of representing the identities of the social movements that were part of the convention. The possibility of a broad multi-party agreements was really rejected by the convention, so there was nothing like a multi-party agreement. There was consensus among the groups that got the 2/3, but as I told you before, that consensus was not enough to guarantee sufficient ideological representation from the broad political spectrum. So the Chilean Convention in the end was turned into a unilateral body. And there are many examples that we can discuss later that show this. The convention released a proposal far away from the prescience of the median voter. And I think that the design of the process has something to do with it. Parts of it has to do with the rules for independence, the electoral rules for independence. Another thing has to do with the fact that the institutions were not relevant enough. So there was a resistance from outsiders that helped to harm the prestige of the convention. One of that, but not the only one. One example came from the Senate, right? The convention proposed to remove the Senate and to replace it by a very weak regional chamber. And senators, of course, were very mad about this, even left-wing senators. Even though it was very costly for left-wing senators to call to reject the draft, they clearly did not support it. So the doubts that they presented and the criticisms that they made showed I think the median voter that the mainstream political parties, not only from the right, were against the proposal. So the mainstream view became the reject vote. I also blame the circular procedure. The fact that there were no default rules elevated the transaction costs. It could have been different if there were default rules approved before. The one-time voting of the proposals were supposed to be voted by 2/3. If they were approved by a simple majority, they could go back to the committees and the committees could send back another proposal until they got 2/3. But this circular process was only driven really by the proposals made at the committee level. And the problem is that the committees were composed by those that had more intense preferences on the specific things the committees were working on. So, for example, the committee in charge of designing the rules of regionalization was composed of members that came from regions that had very strong views about how regionalization was supposed to be done. So the committees were not representative of the medium of the plenary itself. Right, and so it happened at the opposite as in other countries, where we see that the committees are the places to achieve bipartisan agreements that then get confirmed in the plenary. In the Chilean process, we see exactly the opposite. We see the committees proposing proposing norms that are far away. So they are testing the limits of the plenary. They're kind of playing hardball with the plenary. And in fact, the plenary rejected important proposals that came back to the committees and that highlight and emphasize the flaws that the final norms had, particularly regarding, in my opinion, the design of the political system. But this is only an example; it's not the only one. And the fact that we couldn't go back to revise the norms was very important. And this explains why the process in the end was not circular, right? It didn't allow for a double checking. So there were not enough incentives to honor previous agreements made. So a lot of different factions betrayed other factions, and they got blamed in the media by not fulfilling the agreements they had made before. When you have a double revision process, this could have been avoided, like in Colombia, for example, or if you have a more secure process, you could have avoided this. But the design of the rules that the convention made by itself, by detailing the rules made by the Congress before, was really against these things because they were seen as providing veto points that the left wanted to avoid. So they preferred to have the system of voting one proposal, approving that proposal, including it, and not discussing the proposals in a systematic way one with each other. The only way to do that was at the end when the harmonization committee came to put together all the norms, but the harmonization committee was very weak and didn't really have the power to revise the rules that were already approved by the plenary, but they only needed to harmonize the rules that existed. So of course the procedure was very, very flawed. And I think that constitution makers in the future can learn how to not to repeat these mistakes, despite the existence of the temptation of supporting more, I would say, more populist approaches to how the process should pursue. Another thing that it's not in this the slide, but I still believe in it, is the idea that that there was no space really for secret deliberations to boost multi-partisan agreements, so that different factions could encounter middle ground points without appealing always to their external audiences. And these raised the stakes of the negotiations very, very high. And what happened in practice is that when they had the need to achieve those secret deliberations, they did it in an informal way, which of course boosted the criticisms that the convention was received. The situation in the middle changed. So the priorities of the Chileans change. If you look at the polls, you could see that there's a shift in the not in the preferences, but in the way the intensity of the preferences can rank with each other. So now the biggest problem that concerns many people, and is one of the reasons why they disapprove President Boric, is the crime rates that are being elevated in the countries. The political ground is now set for a law and order agenda and not for a social rights agenda, right? So after the social rights agenda kind of failed in the constitution making process that ended last year, the ground was fertile for the far right to come, right? I'm not speaking about the traditional center right or the center left, which moved to the right, by the way, but by the insurgency of the far right. So what came next in Chile? Now we have a new process, was organized by the parties, and the process went to the other extreme. So while the first process was designed in a way that allowed the parties not to control it, and to have these social movements driving it, we have now completely the opposite. We have now a really top-down kind of procedure that is captured by the political parties with representation in Congress. So it's really party-driven. It has less reserved seats for indigenous people. The reserved seats have a different formula now, and only one indigenous people could be elected. We will have default rules, but the default rules will be drafted by an experts panel that is appointed half by the right, half by the left, and they are already they are working, and they are close to finish the first draft. I have read it, and I can tell you that it's a draft that kind of preserves the status quo in many things. It's very conservative. It doesn't really solve the problems of the political party system that we see. The previous draft didn't either, but this one it resembles more what we have today. There's explicit substantive limits, and there is an explicit organ that is called the Committee of Admissibility that will be in charge of enforcing these substantive rules. And I expect to see a lot of debate around how to interpret these 12 bases that they call it, or principles that should be upheld. And then we will have an elected council that will work for 5 months, and an exit plebiscite that will operate in December. The council was elected last Sunday, the council. The difference between the council and the convention is that the council is modeled on the rules of the Senate. So fewer people in fewer districts with less seats per district. This system has historically benefited more the right than the left, but it also benefited strong parties, right, with a large appeal to larger broads of the sectors of the population, and is not very good for smaller parties, which is a good thing in my opinion anyway. And then gender parity, of course, that rule came to stay, right? A legacy from Bachelet was entrenched in the previous movement. Nobody challenges it now. It stayed. Gender parity came to Chile to stay. But independence could not have the electoral privileges that had before. The parties were expecting to see, I would say, something similar than the Senate election of 2021 that we see on the slide at the top. You would see that the right and the left are really split. But you also see that there are not that many coalitions, right? You don't see the fragmentation that we see at the level of the Chamber of Deputies. So you would expect a lot of consensual pacts between them. But what happened is different than that. So parties were expecting to see the Senate composition in the council, but what they got is actually this. So basically, the right is taking over the process. We have the light blue. The light blue is the far right, the Partido Republicano. We have the hard blue. The hard blue is the traditional right. Some of those members are from the center right or a more liberal right. Others came from the more conservative party, which is honestly does not stray that far away from the Partido Republicano. We don't have any representatives elected from the old parties of the Concertación, the Bachelet supporting center-left coalition, which disappeared. We have one indigenous people, and we have 16 people coming from the new pact of the left that brings together many factions. Some of them came from the far left, and others from Boric, the current president coalition. So you could see that the right united has the majorities they require to do whatever they want with the proposal. And what we expect is that they need to present something that can appeal to the large majority so that the proposal can be approved in December by the public opinion. But the presidential elections that will come afterwards next year could help also to drive the process in ways that are unexpected. Today, the most important presidential candidate that we have now is the candidate from the far right, which may be paradoxically a good thing because if he has truly the ambition to get elected, he may want to appeal to large majorities and discipline his own members from the Partido Republicano to moderate themselves. This is only a speculation. I have no idea where this will happen. Maybe he doesn't have the ability to do that. Maybe that party is not able to discipline, because we also need to consider that the Partido Republicano is a very new party. We don't really know much about many of the members that got elected. We have no idea how their discipline is. Some of them have been accused by being non-democratic, but of course that accusation may not hold regarding all of them, and what does it mean to be democratic or not. And we're not sure whether the members of the party that were elected to the council were going to be really driven by the presidential elections. They may expect forecast to offer them jobs in the future. I don't know. That could be a good thing, but that assumes that caste will remain high in the polls. There's also a status quo bias, as I told you, with the proposal that the drafting committee is doing, but perhaps that's not going to be that important if the right has the complete power to do whatever they want with the content. And we have a very unbalanced constitutional council. The previous convention was unbalanced in a political way, but at least it was balanced in a social way. This one is not balanced in a social nor in a political way. We also see that the party system outside the council remains very fragmented. We have 12 committees in the Chamber of Deputies. The committees are an important measure of fragmentation because they show how political parties organize themselves to bargain within the legislative process, and we have 12 of those. That's a lot, and 18 political parties exist. So the fragmentation still exists, and because of the electoral rules and the electoral timetable that we have, it's very hard to predict how this fragmentation will operate in the future. And in the December plebiscite, we have tragic alternatives, right? Either you approve a draft you don't believe in, or the Pinochet constitution remain in place. Maybe you will have the hope that a new constitution making process will take place, but it's very unlikely, to be honest. There's a lot of fatigue about the constitution making process, but maybe it can be rebooted in 5 or 10 years. I don't know. And I expect a lot of calculations to be done. I don't think that Chileans are discussing this issue much today. The most important news in politics in Chile today is the rise of the far right and the Republican candidate is not really related to the constitution making process, partly because there is fatigue about the constitutional issues and partly because the people doesn't really trust the process. Also, perhaps the government made a role by not informing about the elections enough and not building momentum to the elections. So this is an ongoing thing that needs to be, of course, followed to really understand how this will operate. But I think that the central argument that I'm trying to make here, which is that political parties remain and should be included and should be important, and political and constitution making processes should be seen as an opportunity to fix the party system in these conditions, can largely be falsified by the fact that the problems of the party system can also bring other problems of the constitution making process. So thank you.
Thanks indeed. Thanks indeed.